your work with Reclink. Maybe just give a little bit of an insight to Reclink and how it began, and I guess what inspired you to create this organisation and the work you've done since its inception.
Well, 32 years ago on the of St Kilda, I was doing street out at that time, working with the Sacred Heart Mission. Had been invited by Father Ernie Smith. I did train for Catholic priesthood, and I had done a sort of a placement. That gave me a lot of insight. There's a lot in welfare that stops people from drowning, but not a lot that helps people to swim. I also noticed that there was a need for non-clinical therapy, a need for involvement and structure. People were coming there at a low point in their life, very often after trauma and finding more trauma. And one of the powerful and defining moments for me was when I said to a homeless man in the very early times there, because in the first 9 months I did a lot of street outreach. I said to him that I'd had one of those days, and he said, "Peter, I've had one of those lives." But I went on to see that there was so many people that had one of those lives. The sport and recreation, which we eventually put together, starting from Kick to Kick, became a great protector of the vulnerable. There was an extraordinary lack of structural opportunity, accessible opportunity. People were not accessing family, work, sporting clubs. As I said, coming there after trauma, finding more trauma. And it struck me one of the things they liked to talk about was Australian rules. It had great cultural power, and my own experience of growing up of it, that it was very life-giving, very exciting, and got you right into the moment to give you a relief. Gave people, when they played it, they felt so alive. And one person running with the ball, I remember in one of our early teams, he said, "When I'm running with the ball, I feel like I don't have a problem in the world, I also noticed that it gave people an immediate emotional reward. And many, many people that I spoke to at any depth said they had suicidal feelings, whether it was a cricket wicket or hitting a four or a basket or running with the footy, bouncing the ball, kicking a goal. There was this great emotional uplift, and I've found that is critical to build those sort of pathways to move forward. And they also needed something very immediate. Another defining moment as I spoke to, we took a group to the Malthouse Theatre, and I said to a homeless man, "What is one of your goals for the future?" And I realised that he said, "Peter, I don't even know what to do in the present, never mind the future." And I sort of realised the need for that immediacy. One of the great contributions you can make in community or even in Australian life is the power to include. And there was an opportunity through sport to include, and the amazing impact that word, it's just a word, inclusion, but when it comes about in real terms and people become part of sporting teams who otherwise wouldn't, you see amazing results. And I might have made I believe we see some of the most impactful things that can happen in the game of Australian rules, but largely hidden from view. And that's why the book was born, that we needed support for our work. We needed to tell our story, and there was a powerful story to tell. Also, 32 years ago, we started with what evolved from Kick to Kick to social games to a small league to teams now from Maryborough to Morwell. And at various points in Reclink's history, there's been leagues in nearly all states and most territories. 32 years ago, we were taking people from deep isolation in those streets to community and seeing the power and the love that they were getting out of this game. And then other sports we now do 76 different sports and recreation and health and wellbeing programs across Australia. But now the national conversation 32 years later is what our mission was in those early years, 89, or what we were trying to achieve, is the fallout of isolation. The whole country is now talking about it. And our work is really a talking piece, whether people know that or not, in terms of Reclink. That is our mission. And governments across Australia are really beginning to embrace and see the enormous value, particularly state governments. We do have federal government funding, but we do have a lot of communities that we want to reach. A lot of communities are really crying out for something like that. So, the book's born that people will have a deeper appreciation of how it can save lives. A lot of footy teams, there's so much talk about that grand final and heralding the grand final and how much it means. And I think that's a great thing for a club, because when you strive for excellence like that, you have to bring out the very best values in individuals and teams and communities and off-field and on-field. And people have to work together, and it has to be bigger than themselves. So like Tian was saying, the values grow in you. But there's the point I want to make, though. Most teams don't win a grand final. But if we care about our people and the experience of community of our teams, we believe for every Reclink team we start up, lives are saved. And it's common. The most common theme of this book, the resounding theme, was that lives that came through in so many stories was it saved my life, really. And we've heard that. And that was another one of the reasons why I thought this book should be put together, with its 19 writers, 40 testimonies, 20 sponsors, and, a lot of people, probably and people who were interviewed, 100, 120 people probably involved over that 2-year period to try and get something substantial together about sport, looking at it from a different angle. And every story has its own insights around homelessness, mental health, addiction, suicide, etc. So, just reflecting back on those early days, I could see the power of football, Australian rules football, when people with even full-blown drug addiction would come along. The amount of people that were happy to come along to a kick. The informality allows time to build trust. When people are running around with all these issues, they don't always want to talk about stuff, but with a bit of time and care and interest and involvement, it allowed people to talk about and share their journey. And once a person, one of the key insights that came from one of the stories you'll see, I think it's Damien's story, from the time he gave it a voice, he says, from the time I gave it a voice, my recovery began, because I hid my addiction from everybody. But when I came clean about it and gave it a voice, when I became honest about it, I could not believe the support that was out there. And he was part of the Salvo Hawks Reclink team, where nearly every player has a drug and alcohol addiction. They do NA and AA before games. And one player describes it as you had addiction as a clean rush, but it's real.
Well, I noticed a few things, sorry, Peter, that I guess noticed whilst reading the book, The Power of Football, that you obviously helped create and get these stories out that should be heard, I guess, especially from sitting on this side of the fence. I loved reading some of these stories. It really hit home, and it really kind of maybe shocked me to an extent, but also, I guess, as you said, a lot of these sense of belongings. And I found a lot of the themes in which these stories, I feel, what comes through anyway, from what I and my perspective is this sense of belonging, and I guess this tranquility on a football field. That I think you mentioned one of the stories was one of the players at Reclink, once they got onto the football field or a sporting field, it seems like all their problems seem to wash away for that 2 hours during the weeknights. I think you guys do play or along those lines, or even at training. And I have to say that just reading some of these stories, it really touched home. But just setting aside the book and the novel for now, because I would like to touch on that a little bit later, I just wanted you to give me a little bit of the history of Reclink. Obviously, you said you started 32 years ago, but did you think it was always going to be and become, I guess, this big? And were these always the goals set out when you first, I guess, founded the company back, I think it was in 1989, I think the year was. Was it always kind of leading this way, or you kind of just shocked at how much it's grown and how many people you've actually affected in such a good way?
Well, what we recognised, there was a tremendous need for it, not just football, but broader sport, recreation, arts, to impact on the physical and mental health of people. It was something difficult for single agencies to put on. So we formed a membership model, a cooperative model that agencies could become members. We didn't have funds or funding for it, so it depended on agencies and people working together. So you could come into a room as a group of agencies, and different agencies would run a sport or a recreation or something that others could tap into. So Reclink exists more for the agencies of Australia, that they can have sport, recreation, health, and it's not something you can do on your own generally anyway. It enhances the quality of events when groups come together. For example, if you set up a football team, all parts of community very often have to come together to get that achieved. So Reclink is a very resourceful thing, like a worker. It creates reach and resources and goes out and finds the resources. Now, for example, with the establishment of a new team, sometimes I use Sunbury as an example. The sports chaplain was also involved in the Rotary. The Rotary did the barbecues. There can be, very often there's police involvement in the local community, welfare agency involvement. Maybe someone from a local football club would be the trainer. Ex-AFL football coaches would take development days. You can bring so many parts of community together. A combination of agencies would work together, playing different roles to create this. And even so, sometimes it's not the easiest thing to put on. A lot of workers say it's one of the most impactful. So it grew slowly and steadily over a period of time. But what do you do when you have nothing, no resources? You need to bring people together in a room to, it's a kind of a silo breaking model, asking different parts of community to work together.
Yeah, well, I was just going to talk about maybe your history, I guess, with the sport and football. That did you play when you were a lot younger?
Yeah, as a young person, by the age of 12, I think my brothers and I were running twice a day. First year in high school, we were sort of so fit. So I say that I spent a lot of my young life on a high, but it wasn't taking drugs. It was and you were really on a high when you were running that much. It was a part of daily life, really. And the command over the body, you learned so much about discipline and how much it could improve you. We seemed to have a lot of natural motivation. We used to take carloads of kids my parents to the Yuyangs. We'd run in the Yuyangs. And that was a really important part of our life. It brought us great joy playing under 16 cricket when we were probably quite young. And then I wanted to play Little League football. I used to follow Geelong, and we saw Bob Davis, and we wanted to work out how you played at half-time. They started playing young kids at half-time. And I ended up playing Little League football in Corio Lane because there was no teams in Werribee of that age group. And Corio Lane is one of the poor, and still is today, I would think, one of the poorer pockets of Victoria or Australia. And I began to see in community, experiencing and rubbing shoulders with people, how important the sport was to people in their lives as they were struggling with the day-to-day needs of living, and what a lift it gave people, and the meaning it gave people behind that football. So our running club folded too, and we got a choice of who to run for, and I wanted to run, for some reason I wanted to run for St Augustine's orphanage, and my brothers ran for St Joseph's, and we continued our running, but I got closer to people's lives who were doing it hard as orphans and didn't have the support of parents, etc., and began to think more about disadvantaged and how important, those opportunities would have been that I was viewing to those young people to come and do athletics that arrive in a bus and etc. So I guess there was a lot of things that gave me a sense of the value of these opportunities in that sense.
Okay, so another question I wanted to ask now, obviously COVID-19 was a huge worldwide, phenomenon. Obviously it impacted so many people and obviously contributed a lot to this isolation, which you've been, you vowed to kind of, try reduce in Australia through the use of football and through the lens of Reclink. How did you and the Reclink team navigate, the last 2 years and especially that 2020 year?
We were really busy making calls to our players and participants, but we also developed a great online health and wellbeing program. Reclink itself did. So many of our staff across Australia were involved in that. And we were able to create some really great reach and meet a particular need. That's nobody stopped working as far as I know. And we worked very hard through that period. And we also did sports equipment. We were doing sports equipment, but that we ended up doing sports boxes for welfare agencies and backyard sports, and sports equipment and bikes was something that we repaired over 1,000 bikes and gave away a lot of bikes, and there was a lot happened over that period. That, but it also, on a broader level, it did highlight the value of our work, as so many people were affected by isolation. And to this day, we still feel some of that fallout.
Now, there was two names that when I was reading the book and kind of researching about Reclink and looking through the power of football, two AFL players that played, I believe, in a Reclink grand final and then turned into quite exciting and very promising AFL players in Marlon Pickett and Tim Kelly. Can you just give me maybe a bit of their story and their involvement in, I think it was a Reclink grand final, obviously before they got drafted?
One of those players, or two of those, but one of those was Marlon Pickett. And I went over to Fremantle to initiate a league, a football league, and I worked with other people who were tremendously supportive, and I worked along with them. When the league got going, we used to have our grand final at the South Fremantle ground where Fremantle used to train. It was a beautiful ground and a beautiful community there. And Fremantle hosted a lot of our meetings and allowed us to have our grand final day. But they also shared the ground with South Fremantle. They'd heard about, so the story goes, a young man called Marlon Pickett. Marlon, as you know, had a lot of different life challenges, was in and out of jail, etc. And they discovered him that day at the grand final. He won the trophy for the best player, and he stood out and they had a look at him and set up a meeting through a welfare worker who was involved with Reclink. And the rest is history, in a sense. He started playing for South Fremantle, and he was eventually discovered and recruited, as we know, by Richmond. Yeah, and Tim Kelly was also another player who come through some Reclink footy, but I think his dad was a social worker.
I wanted to say one thing that resonated with me whilst reading the book was, and I'll try to quote it here. One of the players, he said, at Reclink, people say my name, but on the street, people cross the road or put their head down into their phones. It's the only time I feel human and worthy. Now, this is obviously playing at Reclink as a player, and as you've touched on, the power of a football, which is ironically, the title of your book. It does give people a sense of belonging and worth and value, and I guess this feeling, of tranquility, this feeling of, there's a lot more to potentially their current situation or their current challenges, which obviously are heartbreaking to hear, but also so riveting to, and I guess on my behalf, so excited to hear that these stories through obviously your novel and the work you've done with Reclink, it honestly warms my heart, as I'm sure it does with yourself and a lot of people involved. And it's great to hear that so many people are excited, as you said, train 4 times a week, 5 times a week, walking around in their footy boots, getting ready for the game. It really does put a smile on people's faces. And I have to say, just for me personally, that I'm very inspired and I guess somewhat proud of the work you have done for so many years, and obviously the people that you brought along with you to do that type of work it's simply outstanding. So I have to tip my hat off to you. But that's it's a great novel. I'm a big advocate for the power of football. I'm a huge footy fan myself, and obviously the meaning and the value and worth it can bring to so many lives is just it's infinite. You just don't know how many people it can touch with that.